Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Rishi Goyal, the director of the new major in Medical Humanities at Columbia University. With over 540,000 deaths in the United States and more than 2.7 million deaths worldwide, the pandemic offers a grim but unfortunately timely backdrop to launch our new major in Medical Humanities. But as one of our leader speakers, Anjali Raza Kolb, asks, is work that stretches back years and years and considers the toxic milieu of race, capitalism, imperialism, disease, and immigration really ever timely? Is timely a kind of dismissal, or is it always ambivalent and untimely? The pandemic performed a social analysis on our society, revealing its fractures, fissures, and priorities. Black, Latinx, and other people of color continue to die and suffer disproportionately, as do nursing home patients, disabled peoples, the street homeless, and incarcerated individuals. Asian Americans are increasingly becoming victims of violence and stigmatization. All of our pre-existing social inequalities and vulnerabilities have been exacerbated by this crisis. It is at this point that medical humanities might emerge as a corrective. Medical humanities engages with humanities, social sciences, and scientific disciplines to emphasize the vulnerability of human bodies, the heterogeneity of anti-essentialist approaches to biology, and the structural determinants of health. The historicizing stance and the critical reasoning of the humanities and social sciences are necessary to understand and emphasize the role of ideologies and cultural assumptions in the production of medical knowledge. The pandemic has reinforced the importance of thinking about the biological concurrently through the lenses of the political, the social, and the aesthetic. Our major began in 2012 as a track in the Institute of Comparative Literature and Society, where it was known as Medicine, Literature, and Society, and spearheaded by then Director Stathis Grigoris at the instigation of our students. Medicine, Literature, and Society was founded on an interdisciplinary commitment to the study of the body and health. Over the last 2 years, working closely with Lydia Liu, the director of ICLS, Anupam Rao, the assistant director, Madeline Doby, the prior DUS, Deans Victoria Rosner and Lisa Hollybaugh, and the Provost's office, we've successfully moved the track to an official major with the approval of the New York State Department of Education, and in so doing, changed the name to Medical Humanities to align more closely with emerging national and international trends and conversations. This approval could not be more critical. I would now like to introduce my colleague and often collaborator, Professor Arden Hegele, to speak about the series that we have designed to mark the launch, Medical Humanities and Pandemic Urbanisms. Arden?
Thank you, Rishi. Good evening, everyone. I'm Arden Hegele, Medical Humanities Fellow at Columbia and the co-organizer of the series. So I'd love to welcome all of you here tonight and to say a few brief words about the design of our launch series, Medical Humanities and Pandemic Urbanisms. Medical humanities is by definition an interdisciplinary venture. And over the next few weeks, you will be able to hear and experience the best that interdisciplinary thinking centered around medicine has to offer, from cultural studies and history to architecture, internal medicine, indigenous studies, and young adult fiction, among many other disciplines. And just as the pandemic has revealed new cross currents between social groups, practices of capital, and networks of information, we hope that our series will spark unexpected connections between disciplines that seem at first divided. We hope that you will join us each week to hear from scholars on topics as broad as institutional racism in medicine, indigenous practices and precarious city life, and how to reconceive of urban spaces following COVID-19. And as part of our celebration of undergraduate education, we're also thrilled to feature a multimedia student design challenge open to undergraduates from any American university. We're grateful for the generous sponsorship of the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society, the Society of Fellows and Heyman Center for the Humanities, the Temple Hoyne Buell Center for the Study of American Architecture, the Weatherhead East Asia Institute, the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures, which is sponsoring tonight's talk, the Department of English and Comparative Literature, and the Department of Medical Humanities and Ethics at Columbia University Irving Medical Center. Tonight's event will be moderated by Professor Lydia Liu, the Director of the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society at Columbia University. Welcome, Professor Liu.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Good evening. Also, thank you, Rishi and Arden. You have done an amazing job organizing the launch of this exciting new ICLS undergraduate major in medical humanities, the only of its kind at Columbia University. The Institute for Comparative Literature is the host of both today's event and the panels and lectures in our Medical Humanities Majors Lounge over the next several weeks. So check our website. And it's my unique pleasure and privilege to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Ari Heinrich. Ari is a prolific author. He is chiefly known for his important research relating to the subject of medical humanities. I have taught his 2008 monograph, published by Duke University Press in my graduate seminars many times. The title of this book is called The Afterlife of Images, Translating the Pathological Body Between China and the West. 2 years ago, Ari published a new book called Chinese Surplus, Biopolitical Aesthetics and Medically Commodified Body. And this came out very recently. He has written widely on Chinese and transnational visual cultures, medical illustrations, and queer theory. And his studies range from the history of medical photography to the exhibition of Chinese cadavers in internationally circulating anatomical displays. Ari is also known for his translations of key works of queer literature from Taiwan in the late 20th century, such as Qiu Maojing's Last Words from Montmartre, published in 2014, and Chi Dawei's The Memories, which will come out from our own Columbia University Press in June this year. Ari is the recipient of the Creative Capital Andy Warhol Foundation Arts Writers Grant for a book he's writing, which is an experimental glossary on the work of bio-artist Jess Fan. Ari is a professor of Chinese literature and media at the Australian National University, and he teaches experimental art writing, queer and speculative fiction. He says he recently joined the editorial board of an online journal called The China Story, based at the ANU Center on China in the World. And they invite contributions from researchers, students, and professionals on topics relating to mainland China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the Chinese diaspora, including but not limited to international affairs, politics, history, culture, and society. I am relaying his pitch to you, to this audience. Now, following Professor Heinrich's lecture, Professor Eugenia Liu will engage him in a conversation. I thank Eugenia for taking the time to join us today. As many of you know, Eugenia is the director of the Weatherhead East Asian Institute and professor of Chinese history in ELAC at Columbia. Her research focuses on the history of modern China. Her books include Public Passions, the Trial of Shi Jianqiao, and the Rise of Popular Sympathy in Republican China. This book received the 2007 John King Fairbank Prize, and it came out in the same year. Her new publication, called Vernacular Industrialism in China, Local Innovation and Translated Technologies in the Making of Cosmetics Empire, was published last year by Columbia University Press. I attended the book launch just a few weeks ago. This book explores how lettered men of early 20th century China pursued industry and science in unconventional ways, experimenting innovatively with both local and global practice of manufacturing. Eugenia is the recipient of many honors and awards, including the Charles Riscam Award from ACLS and the National Endowment of the Humanities grant, as well as the 2013 and 14 Faculty Mentoring Award at Columbia's Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. She has recently been a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study, and she was featured in History News Network's Top Young Historians back in 2008. Her current research project, called Making the Chinese Copycat, is a book about China's involvement in shaping 20th century global regimes of intellectual property rights, from trademark infringement to patenting science. It investigates the local vibrant cultures of copying and authenticating in China, as well as looking into how China emerged as so-called quintessential copycat in the modern world. I very much look forward to reading this work as well. Finally, before I give the Zoom podium to our keynote speaker, I want to mention quickly that we are going to keep the event within the limit of 1.5 hours, but I will try to leave some time for the speaker's interaction with the audience. The audience will find a Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom page where you can type your questions, and we'll bring them to the speaker's attention. And I want to thank all of you for joining us, and also to acknowledge again the Weatherhead East Asian Institute's co-sponsorship, as well as the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures for their support. I think this event is very timely, with broader significance, as we're confronted once again with the surge of anti-Asian racism in this country, in Australia, and elsewhere. Now, welcome, Professor Ari Heinrich. It's your turn.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? All right, I will share this screen, hopefully. And, hopefully that works. Can everyone see me, hear me, everything?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. It's a little bit hard for me to tell on my side. So first of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this event for inviting me to speak today. It's a real pleasure, as I said earlier, and an honor. I often feel sheepish when I'm talking about medical history with doctors, because I worry about all the things that I don't know. But at the same time, I've also often openly and publicly lamented the missed opportunity of what can feel like a completely arbitrary divide between science and the humanities. And that's a divide that separates us always into falsely opposed camps to the detriment of everyone. And I've reflected on some of the fear involved in boundary crossing between science and the humanities, that leap of faith and trust that's required when you reach across that divide. So it is, and I mean it sincerely, especially meaningful to me personally to be somehow even peripherally involved in the inauguration of such an important bridging program. I'm also excited to participate in this event because I feel the significance of the establishment of a medical humanities major at Columbia could not be more timely. The archival substance of my talk today focuses on tracing certain highly transmissible strains of anti-Chinese rhetoric about pathology back to their roots in 18th and 19th century misunderstandings and misrepresentations about medicine and culture and race. And in fact, I think one thing that the archives reveal is that these earlier misunderstandings in many ways really do predict with uncanny accuracy the shape of current dilemmas around COVID-19 and its relationship to anti-Asian violence. And I'll say more about that. But that said, I'm especially mindful that this talk, that this day, this week, this year, occurs at a time when the ongoing crisis of anti-Asian violence is receiving extra media attention, and when the contagion of anti-Asian racism is getting worse. And not only that, at a time when the WHO is about to release its much anticipated and potentially inflammatory report on the origins of that other highly contagious disease, the coronavirus. So while my primary focus in my talk today is on discrete historical examples that illustrate the transmission and evolution of specific anti-Chinese racist stereotypes about pathology in the past, really my intention is to contextualize some of the things that are going on in the present moment to contribute ammunition to anti-racist educational initiatives. So with that in mind, in terms of the structure of my talk today, what I'd like to do is divide the talk into two parts, moving from the specific and the archival to the more general and exploratory. So in the first more specific part, which is the bulk of the talk, I will dive right in to describing one and maybe two historical examples, depending on the time, of the circulation of early anti-Chinese animus associated with pathology, and track how these ideas emerged and ultimately contributed to the formation of the conceptual platform for the racial animus against Chinese people that undergirds familiar stereotypes today. This part of my presentation is based on work that I've already published in various forms. So my hope is that if it sparks anyone's interest, you'll let me know, and I can point you to more detailed resources. And I should add that and I wonder if other historians in the audience can identify with me that there's that weird paradox when you write about terrible things that you desperately hope that your work will be irrelevant. And it's a little disturbing when it is still relevant. So that's work that I'm always happy to share in other ways as well. And this first part of my talk should take less than 30 minutes. But the second shorter part of my discussion is one in which I'd like to offer some theoretical context for my research by elaborating on the assertion in the title of today's talk that the future repeats itself. In this second part of my talk, I'm going to focus on the question of narrative itself and ask what we as doctors and scholars and students can do when confronted with what often seems like the overwhelming foreclosures of current narratives linking pathology to Chinese and Asian identities. My hope here is that if by exposing the historical roots of anti-Asian racism related to pathology and their foundations in narrative, we can be freed to change that narrative going forward and to focus instead on our common enemy in the fight against COVID-19, systemic structural racism and its vested interest in maintaining the unequal hierarchies of wealth and power. So let me begin by diving right in with the facts. The outbreak of COVID-19 has coincided with a well-documented escalation in incidents of violence and verbal abuse, not just towards Chinese Americans, but towards anyone of East Asian descent throughout the US, Europe, and Australia. And of course, our former president contributed to the problem and in his rhetoric about the virus. And for its part, mainland China, on the defensive in response to that, began to attempt early on to control the narrative, not my words, of the disease in various ways. And this has escalated in ways I'm sure I don't need to repeat here. But the intensity of this eruption in the everyday magma of popular anti-Asian racism can't be explained by geography or nation alone. The intensity of popular anti-Chinese racism in the age of COVID-19, in fact, springs from deeply entrenched stereotypes of Chinese cultural practice and practices that have been circulating for hundreds of years. Contributing to the development of prejudice in the United States, Europe, and Australia, these stereotypes characterize China and Chinese people as uniquely vulnerable to certain pathologies, whether physical, cultural, or spiritual, and therefore attribute Chinese people with responsibility for spreading disease. But as is all too often the case, these stereotypes are based on bad information, information that can be traced with remarkable precision to specific politically charged exchanges from as far back as the late 18th century. If we put it another way, the COVID-19 pandemic did not cause racist violence today. Opportunistically, it tapped into long-established streams of anti-Asian aggression. Now, that being the case, what are some of the specific historical tributaries that fed into these streams? Where do perceptions of Chinese propensity toward pathology actually come from? Many roots of current anti-Asian racism lie in late 18th and 19th century misinformation about Chinese cultural practices, which were communicated down the years in a game of trans-historical telephone. And an archetypal and stubbornly persistent characterization is, for example, that Chinese people at first and later Asian people more generally pose a collective existential threat to the West of yellow peril. This idea has its roots in a Chinese resistance to Western imperialism that came to a head with the Boxer uprising at the turn of the 20th century. But while disease sometimes fits under the larger umbrella of yellow peril in Western characterizations of Asian threats, epidemics often generate their own individual stereotypes. Take smallpox, for example, the disease everyone loves to blame on someone else. Like cholera or the bubonic plague, smallpox had been laid variously at the door of India, Turkey, and the Middle East, and China. From the early 1800s, many Europeans and Americans believed that China was the cradle of smallpox, quote unquote. And this was an idea circulated by numerous missionary journals, travelogues, bulletins, and official reports from that time forward. In 1838, for instance, the travel writer Charles Downing wrote of smallpox that this dreadful malady is supposed to have originated among the Chinese and to have spread westward in a gradual manner among the natives of Western Asia until it became as prevalent with the people of Europe as among those of the Center Kingdom. The disease then ran its frightful course, unchecked by the ingenuity and resources of man, spreading dismay and horror wherever it appeared and blighting the loveliness and beauty of the fairest works of creation. This Chinese had, Downing added, invented the practice of inoculation early on, so he did acknowledge that. But unfortunately, he wrote, inoculation didn't eradicate the disease, as if in some measure to compensate the nations of the West for the dreadful gift which they had bestowed. The Chinese discovered, he wrote, towards the close of the 10th century, the mitigating effects of inoculation. This practice, by which it was vainly hoped that the original disease might be entirely eradicated, followed the same course and soon became common as far as the shores of the Atlantic. Now, Downing got his information from a single and singularly unreliable source, an 18th century essay by the French Jesuit missionary Father MarcusSibo called De la Petite Vérole on smallpox. Sibo composed the essay in Beijing in the late 1760s, but it didn't reach Paris until around 1772. This essay begins with the punchy proclamation that smallpox had existed in China for 3,000 years and claims to summarize what the author saw as many very knowledgeable and very boring Chinese essays on the origin and cause of smallpox. So this is late 1700s. Sibo dismissed unambiguously what he viewed as the quote unquote pathetic stupidity of Chinese medicine, and he described its lunacy and inconsistency and declared the history of Chinese medicine to have been obscured by, quote, clouds of idiocy. And earlier report from 1726 on smallpox by a different French Jesuit entirely, Father François Xavier d'Entrecolle, had adopted a more neutral tone. Where d'Entrecolle had investigated Chinese inoculation practices with an eye toward finding something useful for Europe, Sibo reserved his most acerbic, most acidic critique for the practice. Yet the management of smallpox and the practice of inoculation was actually quite advanced in China, especially compared to France during the same period. And this is something worth elaborating, especially now. As early as 1622, the Manchus, which people from the north who would soon conquer the Ming and establish the Qing dynasty, had already implemented smallpox reporting systems within the context of the banner systems that they'd established as a basis of social, political, and military organization. The banner system required squad leaders to report anyone showing symptoms so that they could be quarantined, 1622. Clear guidelines also ensured safe interactions with non-Chinese and Mongolian dignitaries, protected the emperor during audiences, and applied to funeral rites and the stationing of military personnel. So for example, sending officers who had acquired immunity already to smallpox, sending these officers to regions where the disease was known to be active. The Manchus also set up strictly maintained bidoso, which you can translate roughly as smallpox avoidance centers, which were essentially quarantine centers where the emperor might retreat during the seasons when smallpox ran rampant. Both the Kangxi and Qianlong emperors were inoculated against the disease, as were other members of the imperial retinue. In 1739, Qianlong even sponsored the compilation of an imperial medical anthology that contained a special section devoted to smallpox diagnosis and inoculation, the very text upon which Sibo later claimed to base much of his own essay de la petite vérole on smallpox. This imperially subsidized reference work not only included detailed illustrations to aid highly specific diagnosis, but also summarized existing treatises on smallpox and provided precise descriptions of how to prepare smallpox matter for inoculation, instructions for creating the optimal conditions under which to perform inoculation, descriptions of adverse reactions to inoculation, and suggestions for post-procedural care. Given this advanced institutional response to smallpox and the practice of inoculation in China at the time, why would Sibo choose to represent the Chinese situation so pessimistically? It came down to politics. When Sibo left France for Beijing in 1758, inoculation was becoming the subject of heated controversy between the church and Enlightenment thinkers. This was because inoculation, to be distinguished from the later practice of vaccination, inoculation used material from the disease itself to stimulate an immune response. And so while it did sometimes lead to full-blown smallpox, more often it actually immunized the recipient against the disease. It succeeded in protecting them from death. At the time, the church considered the disease to be a kind of divine plague or scourge. And Voltaire was among the French intellectuals who actually supported inoculation, but the church believed that inoculation interfered with divine will. And by 1763, the church banned the practice of inoculation entirely. The controversy ended abruptly in 1774, when Louis the 16th, having witnessed Louis the 15th's gruesome and untimely death from smallpox, had himself inoculated. Based And I'm not going to point any fingers, but perhaps that reminds you of someone. Based on his knowledge of the political situation in France at the time of his departure for China, Sibo realized that if he represented Chinese responses to the disease in too positive a light, he risked giving ammunition to Enlightenment thinkers who were arguing against the stance of the church. Sibo chose to invert the narrative by critiquing Chinese medical practice in a broad, general way, and using China's success in establishing institutionalized preventative measures around smallpox as evidence of Chinese vulnerability to disease. As the meticulous medical archivist and plague specialist Wu Liande noted in the 1930s, Sibo's essay, and particularly his claim that smallpox had existed in China for 3 millennia, was subsequently repeated often, including in, quote, quite some modern compilations, such that, quote, China was even considered to be the cradle of smallpox. A reference to Sibo's 18th century essay made it unchallenged as the source of a footnote on China in Donald Hopkins' otherwise definitive 2002 World History, The Greatest Killer of Smallpox in History. I relate this episode in the escalating narrative of smallpox in China because it eventually contributed to the development of an even broader and more insidious stereotype, linking Chinese identity to pathology. And that's the notion that China was the sick man of Asia. According to this idea, China and Chinese people are uniquely susceptible, not only to smallpox, but to many other ailments, whether corporeal, cultural, or symbolic. And coinciding with the development of influential pseudoscience about race in the late 19th century, these notions gained momentum until eventually, by the early 20th century, China became known not only as the cradle of smallpox and the sick man of Asia, but as the original home of the plague, a source of cholera, which was known otherwise as the pestilence of the East, and a place where men were constitutionally weak. Oh, wrong slide. Now, in Sibo's time, China still occupied a dominant position in the European psyche in relation to trade and culture. Many Europeans viewed China not just as a desirable trading partner with its magnificent porcelain wares and teas and spices and other goods that were highly sought after. It was also seen by some, including by Voltaire, for example, since his name keeps coming up, as a potential source of medical knowledge and positive models of government. But China's status plunged after Britain and France defeated it in the Opium Wars, the so-called Opium Wars waged so that opium could be exported to China in the middle of the 19th century. As European and American imperial powers made advancements in medical, martial, and medical, martial, industrial, and agricultural technologies, they also formalized colonial labor practices, exploiting the global slave trade and trans-Pacific commerce in Chinese laborers for such projects as railway building in the US and gold digging in Australia. In other words, the accumulation of wealth became even more explicitly enmeshed with the expansion of colonial enterprise, which in turn had consequences for perceptions of the origins of various pathologies. And this coincidence of technological, economic, and political expansion created a perfect storm of conditions for the typecasting of Chinese and other non-Western groups. China emerged from this period not as a source of cures, but as a source of pathologies. Now, a particularly vivid example, which I'll sort of abbreviate for the time being and leave it open for later, but an example of China's emergence as a perceived source of pathology instead of a source of a cure is, of course, the American medical missionary Peter Parker, his association with the painter Lancos. Parker had opened a hospital in Guangzhou, and like other missionary doctors had sought to use Western medicine to win converts. Now, this is something, one of the reasons I feel vaguely comfortable about fast forwarding through this section to save time, is just that at this point, Lancos inspired so many scholars, writers, other artists, that there's a lot of material out there engaging with the legacy of his works. And so I've included the cover of that 2008 book here, and you can see a kind of milder example, this very handsome figure, and you can see there's like a pathology, a growth represented at the top of his head. Now, some of Lancos' pictures were much more dramatic, and I tend to, I no longer show them in talks, partly because I don't want to re-traumatize, I don't want to reproduce the problem that I critique, which is that sometimes the images are only understood as a representation of pathology and not as a representation of humanity. But in any event, when something to remember when looking at his paintings is that at the time they were made, photography was still in its infancy. So you can imagine that if you had to choose between two images, one that was like a bad black and white photocopy, essentially, and one that was this lush, full color, nearly life-sized oil painting where you could see the strokes and the gleam of light on someone's skin, which one would leave a greater impression on you? It would definitely be the painting. So it's with that force, that power, that's a bit hard for us to imagine from our technological moment, that these images really conveyed a sense of visceral pathology to European and American audiences when they saw them. It was like a collateral damage. So that's something to talk about. Oh, I'm just going to signal boost this article by someone who was a colleague of mine, Simeon Mann, which addresses the kind of more global context of anti-Asian violence and US imperialism. And I'll come back to that hopefully in a minute, but this is one of my all-time favorite quotes. I'm not going to get a tattoo of this quote because that would be overkill, but let's just say that I find myself using it all the time to the point where maybe I need to find something else. And when I do, I will, something that's better than this one, I'll use that. But in the age of COVID-19, examples like the case of smallpox and the paintings by Lancos make the current politicization of vaccination and the challenge of sorting through disinformation about the origins of the pandemic feel uncannily familiar. What can we learn about the economic motivations behind the proliferation of fake news about political opponents in a time of intensified trade wars? The old French adage that the more things change, the more they stay the same seems to be more apt today than ever. But it can take years or even centuries for the truth about a given circumstance to emerge. Before rushing to translate our anxiety about the latest dreadful malady into aggression against those perceived to be responsible, I think what we really need to be asking is who stands to benefit from this racialized discourse? Who is profiting from it? And that's a little why I'm using Mann's paper, because he addresses some of those larger structural issues. So with your indulgence now, I'm going to switch gears and move to the second part of the talk. And circle back to the idea of the future repeating itself. And I promised I would elaborate on what I meant by that more, knowing that it could sound a little bit cynical. And so what I wanted to explain was that in thinking about the future repeating itself, I mainly want to communicate two things. The first and perhaps most obvious thing on my agenda in referring to the future repeating itself is that I want to signal my deliberate engagement with the idiomatic principle that history repeats itself, or that if we fail to remember the past, we are doomed to repeat it. Particularly when it comes to pandemics and their comorbidities of racism and stereotyping. The examples I share with you today from hundreds of years ago, their strikingly familiar signatures do seem to suggest that our failure to remember the past has condemned us to repeat it. And in this climate of extreme anti-Chinese and anti-Asian violence, this suggestion that we are in fact doomed to repeat the past can feel a bit depressing, to put it mildly. Yet perhaps more optimistically, one of the things I'd like to suggest today is that the problem we face in debunking historical stereotypes of Chinese pathology now lies less in the fact that we are failing to remember the past than in the fact that we are failing to account adequately for what we mean and what we want when we talk about the future. As we think about the relationship of past and contemporary stereotypes about Chinese pathology, what would it look like if we steer away from formulaic narratives of causality and blame, and instead focus actively on envisioning the future we want? Which brings me to the second thing I would like to communicate when I refer to the idea of the future repeating itself, namely, that the way we tell the story of the conflation of anti-Chinese racism and pathology, the form of the narrative itself, can also determine its outcome. In telling the story of this latest pandemic and future pandemics, can we think about what kind of story we're writing or want to write? Is it a romance? Is it a Bildungsroman? Is it documentary reporting? Each of these genres have their own rules and arguably even have their own ethics. What would it mean to engage consciously with these ethics when we construct such important narratives of the past as the story of COVID-19? In his cleverly titled book, The Future of the Past, Alexander Stille talks about innovations in conservation practice for archaeological sites in China, such as the digs that produced the famous terracotta warriors, and the dramas that ensued when Italian and Chinese conservators couldn't agree about what counts as authentic in the preservation and display of artifacts and replicas. And together, both of these groups, the Chinese and Italian conservators, were forced to negotiate the terms of what the future of this past literally would look like. When we tell the story of how Chinese identities became conflated with pathology historically, and how they impacted anti-Asian racisms today, what legacy will we choose to leave the future? Can we, as doctors and scholars, claim more agency in this process? How closely will the WHO's forthcoming report about the origins of COVID-19 resemble the exchanges between Jesuits in China and regents back home in Paris 250 years ago, when they constructed resourceful narratives of culpability and cure to contain the trauma of their own horrible scourge, smallpox? Or maybe what I'm asking is, Is it that history repeats itself, or is it that history changes, but the narratives remain the same? The disease itself, or any disease, is hard enough to treat, and it depends on the hard work and commitment of scientists and doctors and research infrastructures. But some more good news is that the cultural aspects of disease, things like ignorance and racism, are also often preventable, treatable, and even curable through education. As I said at the opening of my talk, the introduction of this new medical humanities programming at Columbia is very timely. It's needed now more than ever, and not just because of the seeming inevitability of racism in a pandemic, but because of the inherently future-oriented thinking of a program that aims, and here I'm borrowing directly from the ICLS website, a program that aims to develop students' ability to think critically about the reciprocal relationship between health and culture. It's an opportunity to educate by drawing connections in the classroom among histories of pathology, racism, and new technologies, regardless of background. So to start wrapping up, I want to ask you a personal question. Just something to think about, and maybe especially the historians, but really everyone. And that is, can you think of a poem or a story or some work of literature that has left an indelible mark on you for whatever reason? Maybe it's where you were at that moment in your life when you read it. Maybe it's some piece of literature that has a kind of lock and key fit with some of your own personal history. But can you think of that feeling that you get when you encounter a piece of literature that somehow implants a kind of linguistic rhythm in your head that then becomes, and I couldn't really think of a better way to describe it, but that a linguistic rhythm that becomes a kind of language window through which, from then on, you begin to view the world or some small part of the world. It changes like the frame of a painting, that from now on, there's something that you always hear or see through that work of literature. For me, a poem like that is one that I first read more than 25 years ago in an anthology edited by Sharon Lim Hing called The Very Inside, an anthology of writing by Asian and Pacific Islander, lesbian, and bisexual women. The poem is called Shrapnel Shards on Blue Water, and it's by the Vietnamese-American author Lê Thiem Thuy. And the poem is too long to read here, though as you can see, I'm dutifully flashing a copy of it on screen. But in grossly oversimplified terms, the narrator describes to her sister vignettes from her family's relationship to the ocean, to immigration, and to Vietnam. And in a very effective violation of the rule of writing known as show, don't tell, she violates it. The narrator explains within the poem itself what she's trying to do. She says to her sister, and therefore also to us readers, I tell you all this to fill the void of absence in our history here. The narrator then closes the poem with an injunction, switching suddenly and powerfully and neatly to a much more declarative mode. She instructs her sister, with whom we are now structurally aligned, which amplifies the poem's effect. She instructs her sister to, quote, let people know, and then in capital letters, Vietnam is not a war. And then she repeats it exactly, let people know, capital letters, Vietnam is not a war. And then concludes, but a piece of us, sister, and we are so much more. Now, in structuring her poem this way, the poet performs something. She performs a move that I think can be useful to us too, in framing how we understand or narrativize and re-narrativize what China means in the context of a global pandemic. So in closing, I want to learn from the poet Lei Ti Yim Tui's structure for a minute and propose to my friends and colleagues and students of all backgrounds that we use this occasion of the inauguration of a new medical humanities major at one of the world's best universities to amplify an important message. And I know that I'm preaching to the choir here, but still, for those for whom it may be meaningful to hear, China is not a condition. It is not a virus. We can object and loudly object to things that, for example, the mainland Chinese government does. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. But let's also keep in mind the dire consequences for real people of our own narratives of pathology when they are centered on blame and recrimination. Because it is at least partly due to these failures of narrative that in the US, Australia, Europe, and beyond, anti-Asian racism has become a crisis of public health. Anti-Asian racism is a public health crisis. Let programs like Columbia's wonderful new medical humanities major be at the forefront of education initiatives that prioritize this issue, this emergency, both now and in the training of future doctors, writers, scientists, activists, and scholars. Thank you for listening to me today, and I'll welcome any comments or discussion as I try to close this PowerPoint screen.
Thank you, Ari. I could not think of a more powerful opening to our launch of the new Medical Humanities major. I now invite Professor Eugenia Liu to join you for a conversation, maybe 15 minutes or so.
Okay.
Yeah, so thank you, Lydia. I wanted to echo Lydia's comment, Ari, that I think you surpassed all expectations in terms of presenting a talk that is so fitting in so many ways. The timeliness, its relevancy to medical humanities, and also the prescriptive nature of the talk and the sense of hope. I really just incredibly, found this as such an inspiring talk. And I will mention, as a good historian, that I also liked the historical aspect of it too, and just found your historical example very gripping. But I think in this talk we also see the multifaceted sides of Ari Heinrich as a scholar and as an activist. Here, again, the historical element is strong. You are trained, as I understand it, as a literature scholar, and the literary analysis of that final poem really showcases the sort of your literary background. But what I've always so deeply appreciated about your work, again, sort of revealing my own sort of disciplinary biases, is again the real commitment to historical topics and the interdisciplinarity of your approach that addresses very serious concerns, including structural inequity along the lines of race that's linked to capitalism and imperialism historically and to the present day. And finally, I think the other aspect of Ari Heinrich as a scholar and as a committed citizen of the world is the activist commitment that comes through loud and clear in your work in general, but in this talk. So I wanted to, again, just reiterate or reaffirm what Lydia said. This really could not have been a better keynote to launch this medical humanities major. I think the other aspect that was really effective in terms of just modeling what it means to be a sort of a really deeply engaged, multifaceted interdisciplinary scholar is that you're helping us articulate what medical humanities should be. And that is something Rishi and Lydia and Arden, they are all pioneers in really thinking how to break down sort of the siloed epistemological and institutionalized epistemologies, right, of that characterize our universities. Sometimes it's hard enough to get, people who are in literature to speak to historians or social scientists, right? The ambition of this particular major is to cross really these chasmic, like huge chasms, right? The medical world with the humanities, both sides not being familiar with the other, epistemologically speaking, institutionally speaking, in terms of the kind of knowledge work that each side does. So I think this is actually an extremely exciting major where, humanities scholars are forced to think critically about how do we engage with science and the achievements and the investigations that take place within the biomedical world. And then in terms of, the medical side, how do we bring in issues like critical thinking about the nature of knowledge, about medical science? How does race, class, power inform the distribution of knowledge and medical care, right? And all of this is coming to a fore, as you so nicely bring up in your talk, because of the contemporary moment that we live in, the highly unique crisis that we have faced, the pandemic, where it's been clear now that, while vaccines and science will, really help improve the situation, issues of structural racism, of inequity, of society, things that humanists are good at examining, are part and parcel of the solution. It has to be part of the solution. And indeed, the pandemic has also exposed how it has become a public health crisis. And this goes directly to your final point: anti-Asian racism as a public health emergency. So COVID-19 has made clear the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on different communities throughout the world, from first world countries to third world countries, how the behavior of certain first world countries have actually exacerbated the situation for the entire world, but also within our own nation and community, how information is being and public health care is being sort of distributed along race and class lines, and how the experience of the pandemic is so raced and so classed and indeed gendered. And much more recently, because of the really appalling acts against Asians, your final cry, anti-Asian racism as a public health emergency, it just really brings home some of what's at stake, really. So that's my first response. I have questions, but I do want to just sort of say I really deeply appreciated the talk, and I just found it so timely, so fitting, and actually hopeful. The final note, the poem, and the question of how do we engage? I mean, it's just a quote. Sorry, Biden and Harris just this weekend said, silence is complicit, is to be complicit, right? So, but what does that mean, right? How? And I mean, I agree with that, right? We can't be silent, right? But I think you're adding kind of a way to kind of concretely think about how we as scholars, as doctors, as activists might start to address the public health emergency that is anti-Asian racism, and I want to push you a little bit more. I'd like to hear about your formulation of how we use the skills of rethinking the narrative, right, in order to engage, especially in this age where there's such deep suspicion of expertise, of academia, and I will say of Chinese academics. One of the, Chinese scientists have been targeted tremendously in these past few months, right? So, and this is directly related to, the previous administration's rhetoric and the heightening of geopolitical tensions, right? So the anti-Asian racism, which we're now sort of seeing, it's from it's lofty in the halls of academia, but it's also, in the ground, right, in the subways. I just came out of the subway, and I've never felt uncomfortable in the New York subway. I feel uncomfortable now walking in the New York subway, so it's really a kind of a different moment. But as academics, we are in a position where we're kind of in a defensive crouch. Especially in the US, I would imagine Australia might, there's global illiberalism. China has its own particular politics in terms of cracking down on freedom of expression. So I wanted to hear a little bit more, because I want to start off on a note of hope, because you put us there. So I would love to hear a little bit more about kind of what you are prescribing for us as academics who are trying to engage in this moment where things are really, really tough and tense, and there's great suspicion towards those with expertise. So let me start with that, and then I have a whole host of other questions that emerge from this wonderful talk.
Thank you. Thanks, Eugenia. I love your question. It's the question. Given that, as you're pointing out, we're kind of among all of the other kind of amplified negative things, there's also this anti-intellectualism, this refusal to accept expertise or to be so suspicious of it, and to try to address that, we'd have to do things that are probably outside of our training and skill set in terms of addressing those deepest fears in various types of audience. So my answer to that may be a little bit unsatisfying, but unsatisfactory, but it's sort of but sincere, that I feel like doing something truly like establishing the program in medical humanities is a concrete step towards this, because the only thing that's going to help is making conversations possible. And as soon as everyone shuts down and gets entrenched in their camp, the conversation will never happen at all. So I think a trick going forward, and this is something I think about also now in my new role here in Australia's Center on China and the World and so forth, is how do you actually get these conversations happening across so many levels, whether someone from mainland China or Taiwan or students who are from all these places come together and can't agree. What do you do? And I think about sometimes in literature classes that I've done before, media studies classes. At UCSD, we had some, for long and boring reasons, that many of the classes and I don't know if this is true at Columbia too, but many of the classes in East Asian humanities were massive, hundreds of students. And so that meant that I'd be looking out at a sea of faces, 300, 400 faces, and I'd know that these are people who are from all over the world. And that in this classroom, I love to complain about how difficult it was to address them. But I also love to remember how amazing it is to have this kind of possibility of creating a safe space. Because here we all are in a third party place. Yes, it's an imperialist and difficult place. And I mean, of course, US and Australia. But having that common ground, it provides a platform where we can actually have a somewhat safer conversation, at least in theory. And I know it's complicated, but so thinking in those terms of finding a third space to talk from is something that's helpful. And looking at proactive strategies of mutual aid, borrowing some of the moves in the playbook of activism to try to get people talking to each other, everything from acting exercises to sharing personal connections to literature. Can really help get those conversations started. And then, of course, I'm a completely shameless romantic when it comes to things like the power of art to move people and to be used as a tool. And so I think, well, if we can't have the conversations happening among politicians or if certain scientists are having their voices closed down, can we collaborate on an exhibit? Can we have a conversation that's about something else so that establishes a common bond before the rest of the politics sets in? Now, I recognize in saying that how idealistic it sounds, but I probably wouldn't still be in this job if I didn't have at least a trace of idealism left.
All right. No, I think that idealism is actually very, very necessary. And as I said, that the moment you ended on this sense of hopefulness, and I think that's actually very, very important in a moment like this. I have only a couple more minutes left. I do want to talk a little bit about the content of your talk, which was fabulous. And in part because I think it was eye-opening to me. I mean, I know your work from the past, but I just thought that this was such a wonderful example. The discussion of Sibo, the French missionary who wrote the scathing report about the treatment of smallpox in China during the Manchu, right, 17th century, or he was 18th century, right? But the review and how you link it to the cultural or the politics of Enlightenment France, right? The tensions between the church he was part of the church and representative of the church and Enlightenment thinkers. And what I thought was just so eye-opening as well was your description of the incredibly sophisticated practices of inoculation that were being pursued in China under the Manchus, from preparing inoculation to questions of how to distribute. Obviously, it seemed like it was very elite. It was like the emperor and his retinue and all that sort of stuff. The real elite who had access to the inoculation. But it was really. I mean, what you were describing, I was thinking, the social distancing, or the protocols that they were using then seems to be pretty much the kind of protocols we're still using today. And the fact that there were anti-vaxxers, right? I mean, that the French church basically stood in for the anti-vaxxer. I mean, it was just a really, really fabulously powerful historical example. And hence, the future repeats itself. I mean, that was a powerful title precisely because of you're drawing out the historical parallels. One thing, so you say here, right, that story allows us to kind of think about how China was identified not as a source of cures, right? So basically the erasure of the inoculation technologies that were existing in Manchu China already in the 17th century. But instead it became the source of pathogens, right? And so you have the whole sick man of East Asia, which much of your work, fabulous work, has really demonstrated is inextricably linked to colonialism, right, and imperialism in China. It's the sick man, it's Peter Parker bringing civilization to China, along with the handmaiden of imperialism was science, right, colonial science, colonial medicine. And Sick Man of Asia justified that, right? And it was also the civilization that was withering that needed the cure of the West. I wanted to ask, and that resonates today with, for example, the issue of the Wuhan lab, right? The rumor that it wasn't just that the Chinese themselves were susceptible, right? It's not just that the Chinese body is somehow more prone towards catching COVID. Actually, I found that kind of narrative actually dissipated a little bit. Now there seems to be this emergence of this rhetoric that it's like these evil scientists, or it's not even evil, they're corrupt. They're in the Wuhan, or they're somehow incompetent. It's shoddy manufacturing. It's lack of innovation. It's lack of quality. And these are the things that are being levied against China as this emerging, superpower in 21st century capitalism, where manufacturing is subpar, science is questionable, corruption permeates, and gets in the way of good innovation, right? So I'm curious to hear whether how you feel about that element of kind of the contemporary kind of Asian racism that is part of the current COVID crisis, and are there roots of that kind of narrative and kind of the stuff that you're looking at as well? So maybe just with that question, we can get into a little bit of the content of your talk.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a super interesting one, and I'm glad. This is anything to do with authenticity and copyright. That's yet another thing I'll nerd out on, and for days. So I really can't wait to read more of your work as well on that. But yeah, the question of subpar production, it is interesting, isn't it? I've thought about that sometimes in terms of bodies when I think about, for example, the the plastinated cadaver exhibits that Lydia mentioned at the beginning. So many of us have seen those anatomical exhibits, or at least heard about them, and we know that sometimes they've drawn on actual Chinese bodies to produce, and sometimes not. And the effect is, and I know this happened in New York, that sometimes there'll be an exhibit of the cadavers, and there'll be two competing exhibits. The one is supposed to be the better, more authentic version by Gunther von Hagens, and the other one is the crappier, one, if you go in, they might be leaking body fluids on you and they're horrible and whatever, and those are the Chinese ones. So the suggestion is that the Chinese are even faking human bodies, or that there's something even subpar about the body itself. Like if you want to see a real body, you shouldn't see a Chinese one, or something like that. Something where the idea of the production and the body itself get mixed together. And so in that case, the origins of that definitely go back to 19th century replacement. The idea that it's not that Chinese manufacturers were trying to make something subpar, but that they wanted to make something affordable. And so it really kind of brings to kind of completely, condense the conversation, and do disservice to it. But in talking about these things, as I know, like it's always important to think about who's profiting. That really it comes down to who was making money and who wasn't. And in the 1800s, who was profiting, whose investment was going to be paid off, who got to make money off opium, whose products were being forced to be sold, that lead eventually to where we are now, with this idea that there's something subpar, you're going to be sold a bill of goods, it's not good enough, whatever. It's there, but that's one where I don't have the expertise to comment in more detail, but I know that it's there in the sands, and really look forward to learning from you and other people about that one. And I think also, probably as an aside, there's, if I were to start researching separately more historical accidents to discover what might be the roots of that particular stereotype, because those historical accidents, at this point in my career, they're not accident. I mean, they just keep happening again and again. Every time I think I've stumbled across some random fact, that then I stumble across something else. And at a certain point, you stop stumbling and start walking. It's like, this is how history happens. But in any event, thinking about that, I would probably go back and start looking in representations of Japan in post-war production, and also in those kind of caricatures of in media representations of Asian faces that become kind of collapsed together as evil. And I would look for a link between kind of popular media representations of evil invaders and the Yellow Peril, and what's going on in production at the same time.
Thank you so much. I think maybe I should, Lydia is moderating, and I'm just keeping it, she gave me a strict time line. So I think we're actually already past that. So I'm gonna hand it over to Lydia.
Yeah, if you have one more question, I'm addressing the audience. If you have questions, please type into the Q&A. But in the meantime, Eugenia, do you have, if you have one more question, then you can ask as I see some comments there, but I haven't, I encourage the audience to type the questions.
Okay, yeah. So I actually had a question about you made a very conscious choice not to share some of the images that populate the Lancos study. So your first book, and I fully understand the politics of not doing that, right? In the sense that you don't, it's kind of like trauma porn, right? You don't want to kind of, you don't want to recreate the effect of the image that you analyze so brilliantly in your book, these images of these highly deformed Chinese bodies that were being portrayed in these import-export paintings in the 19th century. And then you in your research and your book, you do such a wonderful job of kind of unpacking and unveiling how those visuals work. So one question is sort of that choice. I mean, how do you now? So is your choice now not to present those images in a kind of a public setting? And what is that? Both, I understand the decision not to do that and the stakes involved, but what does get lost? Or do you feel like nothing is lost? Or what form would because those images are very powerful. And this is something that we as teachers deal with all the time, right? I mean, when I deal with foot binding, do I want to sort of showcase, the foot bound, the bound foot, that kind of, to traumatize my undergraduates to make a point, but, and then to draw them in, right? I mean, there is something gripping about it and you draw them in, right? So sort of the art of media, right, in our presentation, but there is a risk, right, that you are kind of reinforcing, even as you unpack the politics behind foot binding, say, or the politics behind the portraits that you have, the deformed bodies, you might still be kind of, reaffirming some of the assumptions about, the privileging of natural body, the Chinese pathology, and so on and so forth, right? That said, they are kind of effective mechanisms, right, in order to unpack through the shock itself. So I want, and especially you being kind of a media studies scholar, I wanted to hear a little bit more about your choice in doing that, because I thought that was actually a very, very really interesting choice not to showcase that in our talk today.
Thanks for that. Good question. I think partly because we have access to so many kinds of media at our fingertips now, it makes it easier to kind of choose to opt out of showing certain things sometimes, because I can say, in a way I couldn't have, 15 years ago, well, if you want to see more, all of Lancos paintings have been scanned and uploaded on at the Yale Medical Library website or something like that. So they're easy enough for someone who's interested to seek out. But I understand that your question is actually kind of more related to, from what I understood, it's a little bit more like the trigger warning or content warning debate about how do we handle important educational information when it can be confronting or reproduce some of the violences that we're trying to avoid or to discuss. I don't have at this moment, it's not that I will never show those works again or anything like that. But then I'm aware there's sort of like that loud person at the party who, as soon as they come in the room, that's like all conversation stops and you can't hear anything but that person. And sometimes, it's just, I try to be selective about when I introduce those into conversation, because they tend to derail or to draw that in. And they were designed to do that. And they do it really well. So in that sense, yeah, there might be something lost in it. On the other hand, I also have noticed that the works speak to so many people. The conversations around Lancos works have just continued to evolve, and I know that they'll continue to increase in volume. And Lydia mentioned that one of my most recent project is working on a book about the artist Jess Fan, who's like a Hong Kong Canadian artist, currently in New York, and who has also taken inspiration from some of Lancos' work in their own work. And you'll see, and I haven't developed an analysis yet or anything like that, but when you get the chance to see Jess Fan's work, they take sections of Lancos paintings or aspects of it and focus in, and it becomes like a conversation or a dialogue with between two artists and between two people who have had experience of working in multilingual, multicultural art environments where commerce is a factor. And you see the idea in it. This is how I read Jess's work. So it's my reading only. I don't know even if Jess Fan reads it that way, but I see in some of those pieces a kind of reappropriation, a kind of taking on one of these things that normally we would read as a really frightening tumor and turning it into a source of beauty and inspiration and dialogue, like a way of revisioning it. Now, I note that in the work of Jess's that I've seen so far, they accomplish that by compartmentalizing. So you don't always see the entire Lancos image, you'll see a part of it, which is another way of managing that challenging information. So that's just something else that's on my mind, is how does the conversation about these images evolve?
Thank you, Ari and Eugenia, for this conversation. We have some comments here. Not exactly a question. I don't know, can you see it, Ari? On the bottom of this question, this window, perhaps we as people of the world should acknowledge the work of Chinese doctors who are committed and professional to detect new diseases. The COVID would go unnoticed for longer than it did, arise in other countries with less developed medical system. This is just a comment. Maybe it was probably inspired by what you said earlier concerning the smallpox. I don't know if you want to reflect on this, or I do encourage people to type questions if they have you want to interact with Ari. We still have some minutes, few minutes.
Yeah, that's an interesting point that that commenter makes about acknowledging the hard work and innovation and the teamwork and skill of Chinese doctors, and the fact that this disease might have gone unnoticed even longer without their vigilance. And it's true. Now, this is something that I'm still working out. You know, what is my stance? What politics? What position am I going to take? On the whole, though, again, wearing my hat as an idealist, as I mentioned in the talk, I really, and also based on what I've learned in history, the dialogues that focus on blame and recrimination, they're not dialogues at all, but they don't work. It's not helpful to point fingers. And so when, you know, as we wait for the WHO's report on the origins of the coronavirus, I get angry, frankly, and a little bit upset, because they bear so much responsibility. I think these are doctors. I'm not complaining about the ethics there by any means, but rather this challenge of this insistence on focusing on blame. I know, and I mean, maybe doctors here can help me understand this better from an epidemiological perspective, but there's got to be a way of separating out the fact of how something starts, how it evolves, how we manage it and treat it, from who started it, why did they start it, whose negligence led to it, and who do we blame and punish for it. Those two conversations to me seem like they don't belong together, because I've seen what happens when they go together. And that's the kind of story I was telling you today. It doesn't end well. So yes to that commenter. I think it's a really good idea to acknowledge the skills and contributions of scientists, both individual and collectively. And especially because, again, it may be hundreds of years, if ever, before we know what happened. And I understand this may be a bit of a provocative thing to say, but it's true. So yeah, that's my evolving thinking on that issue.
Thank you. Rishi probably wants to ask a question or maybe add to that.
Yeah, no, I couldn't help but have to say something. I mean, I have to echo Eugenia's comments that, you know, this couldn't have been a better keynote for us to think about what we are trying to do here with a medical humanities major. You know, how are we trying to bridge, as you said, the kind of arbitrary boundaries between the humanities and the sciences? And they are fundamentally arbitrary. I mean, we've created them over the last 200 years, and we have to work to uncreate them. And Ari, this work and this talk today, I think, was an example of how we begin to uncreate that kind of those boundaries that we created. And I do want to echo Eugenia's point about the hopefulness. What I actually wanted to bring up, maybe, and you can speak to this, is, you know, one thing that I think I was particularly struck by during this whole experience was the death of the original, you know, Chinese whistleblower ophthalmologist, you know, Li Wenliang, and how at, you know, 33, this young physician who, you know, not only did he provide information to the world about COVID, he died of COVID in a very short span. And it struck me, as someone that worked in the emergency room for months in March and, you know, April and May, and the vulnerability that we felt as healthcare workers. And kind of one thing I wanted to ask is, part of, I think, what the role of the medical humanities is to think about that decreasing small circle of what might be called humanity, right? Part of our job is to increase that circle, and it's always shrinking, what we mean by the human as being a citizen or a migrant or various kinds of persons that lose status as humans. And there's something in this kind of pathology of structural racism and anti-Asian racism that's about dehumanization. And in particular, there weren't the kinds of connections made between US physicians and Chinese physicians. Whereas, we in New York made these sort of emotional connections with Italian physicians. That was something that happened. There were articles written about that. There were actual experiences back and forth of the kind of vulnerability. But in the US, at least, there wasn't that experience, at least in the media, of the vulnerable Chinese physician and the vulnerable Chinese body. And I think that was sort of a lost opportunity for potential connections. And one thing that happened in the US, certainly over those first 3 months, was a definitive suppression of the numbers of healthcare workers that were dying. For months and months and months, it was kept at a static 27, whereas we know that the number was growing, but there wasn't a good record keeping of it. So there's a question in there, so maybe you could kind of address some of that.
Oh no, that actually, I'm learning from you a lot on this. I think, yeah, you're right. It is a missed opportunity that we didn't get to see up close and personal some of those stories in the same way. Again, it might be a while before we know what explanation there is for that lack of information, because there are many potential causes. On a more sinister side, perhaps it was state media intervention. On a less cynical side, it may just be lack of technology, people under siege and not knowing how to deal with this massive problem, all kinds of things. I try to keep an open mind with that, but I fully agree with you. And I was thinking also about dehumanization. So, and here's something, again, just open-ended. I haven't thought it through fully, but I'm on an end of the spectrum of thinking where sometimes I wonder what's so important about being human anyway. I mean, there's animals to worry about and the environment, and can we find a word that encompasses all of us and gives us some kind of bridging connection to other non-human lives. But I take your point, but I know what you mean. That's sort of beside the point. In the spectrum of things, yeah, that it's that shrinking definition of humanity, of who gets to count and who doesn't. There are some interesting discourses out there. I think from in my reading, which is fairly limited based on my disciplinary training, but for sure in Black studies, Sylvia Winter, discussions of what counts as human, what counts as kind, that really complicate and situate the idea of that humanity in the context of structural racism and capital. In other words, how we define ourselves as human is going to correlate pretty much directly to what's going on economically at the time, and who holds the power. But just to signal that there is there's literature out there that will address this far more articulately than I could.
We have 2 questions, if we have the time for both of them. The first one is, could you talk to the problem that actually blame does work too well? Don't we first need to acknowledge that othering is psychologically so powerful, and that's why we regress so easily?
That's interesting. I might have to defer a question on the psychological power of othering to someone with expertise in psychology in that way, because I wouldn't know if that question is talking about it in a sort of abstract sense, like, we as humans have an affinity for an us and them view of the world. There's me and then there's the other. Or are you talking about a kind of deep sense of alienation from yourself that might have psychological, physiological roots even, who knows? Which kind of othering are we talking about?
My understanding is why do people even buy these narratives that is scapegoating, constant scapegoating someone else? So the other question is, Professor Heinrich, how do perceptions of Asian bodies as pathological, contagious, relate to the notion of Chinese bodies as surplus? Maybe this is a question about your new book.
Yeah, thanks for that question. When I used the idea of surplus, I used it cautiously, borrowing from the kind of Marxist tradition. And the idea that I was aiming for, whether I achieved it or not is another matter, but is the idea that in the global economy, in the economy of the world now, of bodies, some bodies are worth more than others. And in practical terms, it tends to be that Chinese bodies are valued less than other bodies in certain economies. So in concrete terms, that might mean, for example, the Body Worlds exhibits of plastinated cadavers. In other worlds, it might mean, referring back to what Eugenia was saying, that any body or anything that we associate with Chinese production is automatically assumed to be of inferior quality. And that means that those products, whether the quote unquote product is a thing or a body, is surplus in the world. It's the extra. And it's heavily racialized. So this argument that I make about Chinese surplus can be applied to other groupings or identities or bodies as well. It's just that my area of research focus tends towards the Chinese, but somebody else could do the same kind of thing and talk about histories of enslavement, and which are deeply intertwined in complex ways. With global economy circulations. I always refer back to Lisa Lowe's book, The Intimacy of Four Continents, and also Lydia, your work on Clash of Empires and elsewhere, when I want to look at the way these circulations were impacting actual practice. So I don't know if that answers the person's question, but hopefully it's a start.
Maybe I should recommend your book, the Chinese surplus. And we do have one more question that just came in. Maybe I know it's been we've been talking for quite a length of time, and this question maybe is the final question. It says, thanks for this wonderful lecture. During this pandemic, the general population voiced out frequently. There are many cases that these so-called public opinions go against experts' advice, science against science, common sense, and humanism. This is a new phenomenon compared with what happened in the 18th and 19th century. And that's why we need a lot more lectures like this one, to negotiate the gaps. My first question is, what are the consequences and mistranslations of Chinese medical practice on the side of France regarding the example of smallpox?
Well, interesting, because I think it's sort of it's that spiral I come back to, that quote by Latour about how the falsehoods of the past and present truths really relate to each other like a helix. That I think that's the way I've come to view it, that these narratives take root, or often you can identify a key point, or like a juxtaposition, like a crossroads that happens. And then after that, they start to spiral, they start to gather momentum and get bigger. And in the case of the French example, it has everything to do with who was in power at the time and the changing balance of world power. So that just at that crucial moment, sort of like being in the wrong place at the wrong time, it just so happened that inoculation debate was happening as the power balance was shifting. The debate in France was happening as the power balance between China and Europe was shifting in dramatic ways. And so the two things kind of combined together in an unholy tornado that has ultimately this trickle-down effect of creating a sense of truth. Like now people hear this idea of Chinese pathology and it just feels true somehow. There's something so true about it. And it's not true. The feeling is kind of a legacy of that building tornado that starts in many places, but that we are, at least in this case, able to identify in France in the late 1700s and in the exchanges with Jesuits in Beijing. So yeah, that's something to think about, to kind of look at nodes maybe where these that get seeded like storms of billowing bad information, or maybe not even just bad information, just information, because we don't always know how to sort it out. You know, I'll say one last thing, which is just that as somebody, a scholar who's, you know, been working in these last couple of decades, I still feel very disoriented when I look at how much information is out there online. And I think, and I wonder if some of you have had the same experience, where the classes I used to teach as popular culture, I now teach as history, because enough time has passed that I have to kind of stop at maybe 2002, because I don't know how to properly parse the information that's available to us online. That's the expertise of newer scholars who I continue to lean on heavily and learn from in trying to sort out these information. So a lot of what I'm talking about that building tornado of history is based on past archival research, and the way information is transmitted has shifted now. So I don't know exactly how it'll apply yet.
Thank you, Ari. We do share that experience, predicament. I see there's one more question, but we have run out of time, but I do see one comment, which is probably a fitting conclusion to our session. It says, such a powerful and gripping talk and discussion. Thank you all, especially Dr. Ari Heinrich. I also wanted to add my thanks to you, Ari, for giving us a most powerful keynote lecture, making all of us, with your deep historical insight to make us think about the future, a different future. I also thank Eugenia for starting the conversation, steering the conversation in such different directions, thinking about the disciplines. And I thank Rishi and Arden for their contribution to this conversation. So Rishi, we're having the second keynote. Do you want to make an announcement, quick announcement?
Sure. So thank you very much for being here. Hopefully we'll see all of you again next week, I think Tuesday, same time, 6 p.m. We're going to have Zeynep Tufekci, who is, I think another person that will embody the kind of interdisciplinary thinking about medicine, the humanities, and the social sciences that we're trying to kind of model and offer during this session. So we'd love to see all of you back again next week at 6 p.m. And thank you again, Ari. Thank you, Eugenia. Thank you, Lydia. Thank you, Arden. This is fantastic.